Welcome to NP Certification Q&A, presented by Fitzgerald Health Education Associates. This podcast is for NP students studying to pass their NP certification exam. Getting to the correct test answers means breaking down the exam questions themselves. Expert Fitzgerald faculty clinicians share their knowledge and experience to help you dissect the anatomy of a test question so you can better understand how to arrive at the correct test answer. So, if you're ready, let's jump right in.
The psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner is interviewing a new patient, a 32-year-old single female who is presenting for evaluation of underlying anxiety. While collecting a social history, the nurse practitioner asks the patient if she has a boyfriend. The patient is uncomfortable with the question as she is lesbian and is now afraid that the psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner will not treat her fairly and with dignity. The NP is most likely demonstrating which of the following? A, an appropriate approach to collecting social history. B, a manifestation of implicit bias. C, an overt implementation of her value system. Or D, a conscious disregard for alternative lifestyles. Okay, this really is a cultural question. It's about culture and discrimination and approaching the patient appropriately and ethically. And the answer to this question is B. B is the correct answer. This is, the NP is most likely demonstrating a manifestation of implicit bias. Now, could it be an overt implementation of her value system? Again, maybe. We hope not, but could it be? Sure. There are 200,000 NPs in the country. Chances are one or two of them, don't have the greatest ethical standard. Could it be a conscious disregard for alternative lifestyles? Again, we hope not. Could it be? I wouldn't say it couldn't, but it's not likely. And we can eliminate A. We know that this is not an appropriate approach to collecting social history. So there's actually a couple of things that are really worth pointing out in this question. The first one is that, well, let's go with the answer. Let's explore the answer here first. I said B is the correct answer. This is likely a manifestation of implicit bias. That's what's typically going on when something like this happens. Implicit bias is the unconscious demonstration of perceptions or understandings developed during our early life exposures and experiences. And by definition, implicit means that the clinician is not aware that this is happening and is not in any way purposely or overtly implementing a personal preference or bias. The term implicit bias, it's not my term. I'm sure you learned about it in school. Implicit bias is a widely used term. And honestly, it's not a great one. I wish they hadn't used either implicit or bias, because both of those just have, somehow a slightly negative connotation. Nobody likes to admit that they could be biased about anything. And yet the concept here is that implicit bias is unconscious, that you're not doing it purposely. You don't know you did it. Probably a better term here might be unconscious tendency. But implicit bias is the term, and that's what we have to know. And again, this is one of those things that I think will very likely pop up on your exam. So you want to be very, very familiar with the term and the potential consequences of implicit bias. So implicit bias, it is a national conversation. Harvard University has they're collecting data for this enormous implicit bias study. If you haven't done this already and you're remotely interested, Google Harvard implicit bias, and you'll get linked to the study. And it's a huge study that is looking at the population's tendency to unconscious or unintended bias, really based upon our upbringing, our exposures early in life, forming perceptions about the world before we're even aware that we're doing it. That's what we're talking about here with implicit bias. So number one, implicit bias is not a bad thing. It's not something to be ashamed of. Like I said, most people don't like to admit they could have them, and yet everybody does. When I did the implicit bias study, I was stunned at some of the implicit biases that I apparently have. One of them being in a traditional family dyad with a male and a female, that the female is the caretaker and the home manager, and the male is the breadwinner. And I was stunned, not only because it didn't mirror my own adult life, but even my mother. When I was a kid, I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, and my mom was a rare working woman on the block. My mom was a professional. She went out to work every day. I was like the only kid in my immediate neighborhood whose mom, had a career and went to work every day and wasn't home. And in fact, my mother made more money than my father for most of their adult lives. And I was just stunned that I could have that implicit bias. But then I realized in reflection that even though my experience at home was one aspect of my experience, but I also, the world in which I lived, my friends, where I went after school, everybody I hung out with, the mothers were in the home. I mean, my best friend, her mom was a very traditional mom, went to the grocery store every morning to get food for the day's dinner. And that's where I spent all my time because my mother was never home, Very often the mothers at school, for school activities, my mother was the only one that wasn't there because she was working, but everybody else was much more traditional. So I guess that's where that came from. Point being, implicit biases are unconscious. We all have them. I mean, there are implicit biases that sometimes people demonstrate a tendency to think that persons with disabilities are like maybe some of the physical disability is maybe weaker or less capable mentally, or that people with disabilities don't want any help or maybe always want help. There's just all sorts of interesting ways that this manifests. So in this particular circumstance, what we're talking about here, most likely, the clinician is just manifesting implicit bias of his or her attitudes toward an intimate partner dyad. I know when I struggle with this in my practice. I see a lot of transgender patients. I see a lot of gay, lesbian, the whole LGBTQIA continuum. And I have a number of transgender patients. And I still really purposely make sure that I am using the right pronouns and the right terminology because it's just my tendency after being raised in the 60s and early 70s to think of an intimate partner couple as a male and a female. There's no disregard for anybody else's lifestyle. There's no desire to implement my value system, and it's not even my value system, but it's just those implicit biases that come from the very early upbringing. So this question allowed us to review all of that, which is important, but also the other thing that I'll remind you before we end this question, that always you have to recognize that more than one answer could be applicable, but one will be the best answer. Like I said, in this case, could it be C? Sure. Hey, I'm sure that there are some clinicians out there who are thrusting their value system on the patient. And I'm sure that there are those who are just consciously like, oh, yeah, I know that's what some people think, but this is my value system. Could that happen? Yeah, it probably does. But the question is, the NP is most likely demonstrating which of the following. And in this society in which we live and practice, B is the most likely answer. It's the best answer.
Thank you for listening to NP Certification Q&A, presented by Fitzgerald Health Education Associates. Please rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast. And for more NP resources, visit FHEA.com.